It's wonderful to see so many fellow Ohioans coming out to learn about one of Ohio's best-kept secrets, and of course I'm talking about Salmon P. Chase. My name is Lee Strang, and I'm the director of the Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics and Culture and Society, the host of this, the first of the Salmon P. Chase Distinguished Lectures here at The Ohio State University. I'm going to say a few words to introduce the lecture series, then introduce Mr. Stahr, our lecturer, but first let me announce the winners of the Chase Center's Student Essay Contest. The Chase Center recently held its first annual undergraduate writing contest on the question, is the freedom of speech valuable or harmful in the United States? The contest's purpose was to provide an opportunity for OSU students to work through and articulate their viewpoints on this important issue. We're extremely impressed with the thoughtfulness and wide variety of opinions expressed in these essays, and I'm now going to announce the top 3 winners. And when I do, if you would mind, if you're present, to please raise your hand and stand up. Our third place winner, who was going to receive a $1,500 scholarship, is Paige Lang. Paige may or may not be present here. Okay. Our second place winner who will receive a $2,500 scholarship, is Prisha Patel. And Prisha, are you here? No? Okay. Yeah. Oh, shoot. Okay. I wonder if I should I wait a couple minutes? Okay, we'll keep going. I got a couple minutes of talking here. Our first place winner, who will receive a $3,500 scholarship, is Min Feldman. Is Min Feldman here? All right, Min. There we are. Maybe we should cheer. Woo! Min did a great job of explaining the importance of the freedom of speech, not just in helping to safeguard people from oppression, which she argued, but also in advancing our understanding about the world around us. The Salmon P. Chase Distinguished Lecture Series was started 11 years ago by Professor Randy Barnett at Georgetown University's Center for the Constitution. The Georgetown Center, which was founded by Professor Barnett back in 2012, is the national leader in scholarship, programming, and education on the Constitution's text. And I had the extraordinary privilege of spending a semester there researching and writing about 9 years ago now. The Georgetown Center for the Constitution is one of the models for the Chase Center. The Georgetown Center inaugurated the Salmon P. Chase Distinguished Lecture Series in 2014 and hosted lectures on numerous topics, including the 13th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, and of course, Salmon Chase, including by our own Walter Stahr. Professor Barnett, who himself has made key contributions to constitutional interpretation, the philosophy of law, and contract law, to name just 3, is with us this evening. Would you please join me in thanking Professor Barnett? If you want to raise your hand, Randy. Thank you for handing the Chase Lecture to Ohio State. We'll continue that tradition proudly. The Salmon P. Chase Distinguished Lecture Series advances our understanding of citizenship well lived and pays tribute to Salmon Chase's immense legacy and impact. It's therefore my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Walter Stahr, the leading biographer of Salmon Chase. Mr. Stahr is a New York Times bestselling author and a graduate of Stanford University, Harvard Law School, and the Kennedy School. And for over 2 decades, Mr. Stahr engaged in legal practice in the highest levels of both private practice and government service, both in the United States and abroad. Mr. Stahr then turned his pen to authoring extraordinary biographies, and he hasn't put his pen down since. His first book on John Jay was published in 2005. His second book on William Seward came out in 2012. His third book on Edwin Stanton, a fellow Ohioan, appeared in 2017. His fourth book, Salmon Chase, upon which his lecture is remarked today, is published in 2023. And Mr. Stahr's current project is a new biography of yet another great Ohioan and one of my favorite presidents and Chief Justices, William Howard Taft, to be published by Simon & Schuster. And we welcome another famous Taft to our audience today, former Governor Bob Taft. Welcome, Governor. In his lecture today, Mr. Stahr will introduce Chase, share the key points of his life, and hold out Chase as an exemplary example of American civic life. He'll speak for approximately 40 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for your questions and comments. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Walter Stahr. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you. Oh, wait, I'm actually on this mic, not that mic, so okay. So most Americans see Chase's name every day because the Chase Bank was named in his honor not long after his death. And now here at Ohio State, people will see presumably huge signs about the Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society. But I can tell you that most Americans do not know the first thing about Salmon Chase. Yeah, maybe some of them know that he was in Lincoln's cabinet, maybe some of them know that he was on the Supreme Court, but that is the limit. And so I hope today to give you a little bit more, so particularly that those of you associated with the center can know why you should be so proud of this person. Chase was born in 1808 in New Hampshire along the Connecticut River. He was named after an uncle who was a prominent lawyer in Portland, Maine, and died not long before the boy's birth. So as he put it, his name made him sort of a monument to this late uncle. He did not like his name. If you are ever offered a letter that is signed Salmon P. Chase, it is a forgery, because he only signed S.P. Chase as a way of getting away from what he called his fishy name. His father died when he was about 10, leaving his mother with 10 children and no money. And a couple years later, to educate the boy, she sent him here to Ohio to live with his uncle, Philander Chase, the first Episcopal bishop of Ohio. They lived, and I'm going to be totally vague about the geography, but they lived 7 miles north of where we are right now. Thank you. In Worthington, Ohio. The bishop wore a lot of hats. He was a farmer, he was a bishop, he was a preacher, he was a teacher. And young Chase spent most of the 2 years that he lived in Worthington working on the farm. He did not like it. Then things got a little better. The bishop was offered the chance to become president of Cincinnati College, and the family moved to Cincinnati. And Chase enrolled in Cincinnati College at the age of not quite 14 as a freshman. By the end of the year, he'd been promoted to the sophomore class. If the bishop had remained at Cincinnati College, Chase would be a proud graduate of that college. But the bishop got into a fight with the other American Episcopal bishops, and he decided to kind of go over their heads to England to raise money for a new college that he wanted to build here in Ohio, what we know today as Kenyon College. And so they all went back east. The bishop got on a boat to go to England, and Chase went home to his family, to his mother and sisters. He taught school for about a year to earn some money, and then he entered Dartmouth, where he did reasonably well, not brilliantly, but reasonably well, graduated in 1826 without a job lined up, but he had a plan. His plan was that he was going to go to Washington, where he had an uncle who was a senator, and surely a federal senator could get a promising young Dartmouth grad a job. Got to Washington, and he talked with his uncle. His uncle refused. His uncle told him that if he got him a job as a federal clerk, he would just spend the rest of his life as a federal clerk. So, no. Chase found himself a job teaching school, and he started to read law. There were no law schools in those days, so to become a lawyer, you read law. He chanced to, well, maybe not chanced to. He read law with William Wirt, who was the Attorney General, and fell in love, by the by, with one of Wirt's beautiful daughters. Chase was in Washington for the bitter election of 1828, when the upstart Andrew Jackson defeated the establishment John Quincy Adams. Chase was very much on the side of Adams and very much against Jackson. He was also there for the inauguration of Andrew Jackson, when Jackson's supporters got so wild that they tore down the curtains in the White House, and the White House had to be closed for a few days for repairs. Chase wrote in a letter that one of the many things that distressed him about the Jackson administration was the way in which Jackson was removing all of the Adams men, and indeed their predecessors. Quote, "Good men are displaced to make room for others of more questionable character. Learning gives way to ignorance, and it is curious to remark that the head of the nation is the most ignorant man in the cabinet, and from him downward influence in direct proportion to narrowness of soul." After passing the bar exam in Washington, Chase uprooted himself, came back here to Ohio to start his practice as a lawyer. Now, here in Ohio, that probably seems like a sensible choice, but it seemed odd to all his Eastern friends. He explained to one of them in a letter that he would rather be first in Ohio than wait 20 or 30 years to be first in Baltimore or some other Eastern city. When Chase returned there in 1830, Cincinnati was a bustling, booming place. The population of the city had doubled in the 7 years since he had last been there. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever been in a place where the population has doubled in 7 years? We're talking, gold rush San Francisco almost in terms of the rapidity of the growth. But sadly for Chase, at first, all of this bustling commerce didn't yield him much legal work. So he threw himself, very suitably for the Salmon Chase Center, into civic life. He founded a lyceum, an organization to host lectures, and he gave a couple of lectures himself. And then he turned those lectures into long articles, which he published in the North American Review. You can still read them. He discovered that it was not easy to find the statutory law of Ohio. You had to find the year-by-year volumes of the statutes, and some of these volumes were so rare that there was only one copy left in some library in Columbus. And so Chase took it upon himself to gather all of the statutes of Ohio, to print them in an orderly way in 3 volumes with indexes and cross-references so that lawyers could find the statutes. One of the local newspapers, the editor got deadly sick, and Chase stepped in, and he edited the paper for a while, writing editorials about local and national issues. In short, he becomes a civic leader of Cincinnati before he's 30 years old. He's established enough that he has enough, wherewithal to marry. And he does so for the first time in March of 1834. That wife, Catherine Garnes, died of childbirth complications 18 months later. He married a second time in September of 1839. That wife sickened and died of tuberculosis 6 years later. He married a third time 4 years later. That wife also sickened and died of tuberculosis. Along the way, these 3 wives gave Chase 6 children. 4 of those children died as infants and toddlers. Only 2 of them survived to adulthood. By the time Chase was as old as I am, all of his siblings had died, including one who collapsed and died of a stroke on his doorstep. Death was a constant part of life in the 19th century, but Chase was unusually unfortunate in the deaths of his family members, his closest family members. Chase was not, when he lived in Washington and when he first lived in Cincinnati, opposed to slavery. He wrote in a letter that little cause exists for that sickly sympathy which many at the North feel or affect to feel with the fancied suffering of the slave. The master has a far more just claim upon our commiseration, for it is a truth that the people of the South live in continual apprehension of an insurrection among their slaves. Views that would not, meet with much favor today. His views started to change in 1836 when a riotous mob, encouraged by Cincinnati city leaders, destroyed the printing press of James Birney, an abolitionist editor. And Chase printed a public letter in which he said that although he disagreed with the abolitionists, he regarded all the consequences of their publications as evils comparatively light when compared with the evils produced by the prevalence of mob spirit. When Birney filed a lawsuit against some of those who had destroyed his printing press, he hired Chase to represent him in that lawsuit. And that case and that relationship led to a far more important case in which Chase defended Matilda, Bernie's half-white, half-black housekeeper, accused of being a fugitive slave. Chase argued that the federal fugitive slave law of 1793 was unconstitutional. Reading the Constitution closely, Chase noted that the Fugitive Slave Clause was not in the long list of the powers of Congress in Article 1. No, it's way back in Article 4, which deals with the relations among the states. Moreover, unlike the Full Faith and Credit Clause, which has a sentence that explicitly gives Congress the power to legislate, to implement that clause, there's no such legislative authority language in the Fugitive Slave Clause. So Chase argued that this clause was merely a compact among the states, not a grant of authority to Congress. The word originalism didn't exist back in 1830s when he was writing this brief, but today, scholars like Randy Barnett would call this an originalist argument, starting with the words of the Constitution. Chase also argued in this Matilda brief that even if the clause was constitutional, Matilda didn't fit the definition of a fugitive. She hadn't fled from one state to another. No, her master had brought her to Ohio. That was actually a good argument, and it would work in some other cases. It didn't work for Matilda. No, Matilda was ordered into slavery, and we do not know what happened to that girl after that. We do know all of these details that I've been quoting about Chase's arguments because he printed them in a pamphlet which would then be quoted back against him in his various political campaigns, arguing that he was so radical that he even favored black voting rights, for heaven's sakes. In April 1840, he was elected to his first office, the Cincinnati City Council. The main issue in that campaign, this is April, not the November election, was drinking and liquor licenses. Americans back then drank roughly 3 or 4 times as much as Americans drink today. I know, it's hard to imagine. And Chase was a temperance man. He voted in favor of a couple of liquor licenses, but then announced that he was not voting in favor of any more liquor licenses. That might win him a few votes among the prohibitionists, but it was not going to win him votes among the huge, I can see the seasoned politician nodding up here, not going to win him votes among the German community of Cincinnati. And sure enough, in April 1841, Chase and the other prohibitionists are voted off the city council. 1841 was a critical year in Chase's life, because that's the year in which he abandoned the Whig Party at the end of the year and joined the tiny Liberty Party, the party opposed to slavery. Chase is often called ambitious. When you get my Lincoln friends together and you ask them about Chase, the first word that leaps out of their mouth is ambitious. And I try to argue with them, look, yes, he was ambitious. I'm not going to deny that. But think about what he did in 1841. He left a promising career as a Whig politician to join this tiny Liberty Party. The Liberty Party in the prior presidential election, 1840, it had received less than 1/3 of 1% of the vote, right? So just a handful of people, you could get them in a phone booth. They were viewed as eccentrics. They were, like the people who thought the moon was made of Swiss cheese, and yet Chase abandons a promising career with the Whigs to join this tiny band of lunatics. As soon as Chase joined the Liberty Party, he set out to change and to strengthen it. First, he made a clear distinction between abolitionism and anti-slavery. He was often called an abolitionist, but he said, no, I'm not an abolitionist. I'm not in favor of the immediate nationwide abolition of slavery. That's impractical and probably beyond the powers of the federal government. No, what I'm in favor of is in looking at the Constitution and reading it as an anti-slavery document. And so, for example, he's in favor of ending slavery in the District of Columbia. And he indeed argues that the Constitution, because of the language about due process, doesn't allow for any federal sanction for slavery, but no, it expressly prohibits the general government from depriving any person of liberty except by due process of law. This meant for Chase that slavery in the District of Columbia and in the Western Territories was anti-constitutional. So during these years, Chase is involved not just in anti-slavery politics, he's also a public interest lawyer, what we would call a public interest lawyer. They didn't use that vocabulary back then, helping black people with legal documents and with court cases, especially fugitive slave cases. The black community of Cincinnati was so grateful that they presented Chase with a little silver pitcher. You can see it today in the Freedom Museum in Cincinnati. And in his speech of thanks, Chase denounced the state's black laws, which impeded the immigration of free blacks into this state and prohibited blacks from testifying against whites in court cases. Think about that for a moment. If blacks can't testify in court in a case against a white defendant, their rights are really up in the air. Chase's silver pitcher speech, which he again organized to be printed in a pamphlet, would be quoted back against him in later campaigns. Chase and his friends made dramatic progress in anti-slavery in the 1840s and 1850s. In 1844, in the presidential election, they increased their share of the vote to a respectable 2.3% of the total. And in 1848, Chase engineered a three-way merger of the Liberty Party and elements of the Democratic and Whig parties into a new party, the Free Soil Party. Chase presides over the Free Soil Convention that year. He's the author of the famous Free Soil Platform, and he campaigns for free soil candidates. Federal senators in the 19th century, and indeed into the early 20th century, were selected by state legislatures, not by popular vote. And in the winter of 1848-1849, there's a complicated situation in the state legislature here in Columbus. The Whigs and the Democrats each have a hair less than a majority. And the handful of free soil legislators, let's say 6 or maybe 8 legislatures, hold the balance of power. And they use this position to strike a deal. The deal has 3 elements. 1, some of the black laws will be repealed. The Democrats will give votes to the free soilers to repeal some of the black laws. 2, Salmon Chase will go to Washington as the next federal senator. He'll call himself a free soil Democrat to sort of give credit to both sides of this coalition. And 3, the free soilers will vote with the Democrats for elections of things like the Speaker of the Assembly, et cetera, so the Democrats can control the legislature. Chase didn't just sort of watch all of these maneuvers from Cincinnati. No, he was here in Columbus several times, twisting arms to get reluctant Democrats, because a lot of the Democrats were not real keen about this, but to get the reluctant Democrats to follow through on this compromise. He arrives in Washington in 1849 as a federal senator, joining a great group of federal senators: Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Calhoun, William Henry Seward. They are all members of the Senate Club at that time. He's not really quite a member of the club, because although he calls himself a Democrat, the other Democrats, especially the Southern Democrats, do not view him as one of their own. And he continues his crusade against slavery in the Senate. In particular, in 1849, he opposes what in 1849 and 1850, he opposes the Compromise of 1850. And in particular, the Fugitive Slave Act, which makes it much easier for Southern masters to use Northern courts to recover their fugitive slaves, or people they claim are their fugitive slaves who may never have been south of the Mason-Dixon line. And then in 1854, Chase is a leader, the leader, I would say, really, of the Senate efforts against Stephen Douglas and his famous Kansas-Nebraska Act of that year. Chase opposes that bill because the territory which we're talking about, which is basically all the way to the Rocky Mountains, had been promised as free territory by the Missouri Compromise. He loses both of those battles. But out of the outrage, the northern outrage against the Nebraska bill and the decline and fall of the Whig Party, a new political party emerges, the Republican Party. And Chase is really a founding father of that party, and his role as such is kind of sealed in 1855 when the voters of this state elect him as the first Republican governor of a major state. That's a short answer. If people say, well, who was this Chase? You can say, well, he was the first Republican governor of Ohio, the first Republican governor of a major state. Being governor was not a full-time job in those days. And he could have stayed in Cincinnati and come up here to Columbus kind of when the legislature was in session. But he decided that he and his two daughters, Kate was at that time 15 and Nettie was 8, would move here. They stayed first in a boarding with a family, and then they bought a lovely house at the corner of East State and 6th Streets. He continued his fight against slavery while he was a governor, but he did other things. He improved the state's educational system, commenting that, quote, no safer or more remunerative investment of revenue is made by the state than in the instruction of her youth. You know, if you're looking for a quote, a Chase quote, to put on some bit of granite here at Ohio State, I would submit that that might be a good one to put there. I was pleased to see, by the way, William McKinley, carved in granite. You know, not many universities in America have that. He spoke often at college graduations because he believed that part of his duty as governor was to honor the young people who attended and graduated from college. And he even gave a learned lecture about Galileo. It's 50 pages of manuscript in the Chase papers. I mean, imagine a governor taking the time to go to the books and read up on Galileo and then give a public lecture about Galileo. In short, he's a person who strongly believes in kind of lifelong education. In 1856, as the Republican Party considered who to nominate for president, there were many who favored Chase. But the party opted instead for a safer choice, John Fremont, the famed California explorer. Fremont had said and done almost nothing about slavery at this point, but that was really kind of the point. He was a blank slate on which they could run a Republican candidate on a narrow platform. 1860 is sort of a similar story. As the year started, Chase and especially William Henry Seward were the leading candidates for the Republican nomination. Lincoln was a dark horse, a very dark horse. I found an article in the New York Tribune from early 1860 that listed 15 different Republican presidential candidates, and Abraham Lincoln is not on the list. That gives you a sense of how, far he is off the running. But as we all know, Abraham Lincoln becomes the Republican nominee. It's a long and really interesting story, and I commend you to the chapters of my books about Chase and Seward that deal with it, but in a sense, the short version is similar to 1856. Lincoln wasn't quite a blank slate. Now, he had said some important things about slavery, but he had very carefully avoided, how should we say, more hot-button issues. He'd never said that he was in favor of black voting rights. Indeed, he said very explicitly in his 1858 Senate campaign that he was opposed to black voting rights. So Lincoln was going to be more acceptable to moderates, and without moderates, it was not going to be possible for the Republicans to win the 1860 general election. Immediately after that Chicago convention, when Chase, to his great disappointment, is again sort of ousted of the prize of the Republican presidential nomination. Immediately afterwards, on the evening when the news comes through, he's here in Columbus and he gives a speech on the steps of the courthouse. I really love coming here to Columbus because it allows me to sort of focus on all the details of the book that are in Columbus. He endorses both Lincoln, the presidential, and Hamlin, the vice presidential nominee, and he predicts that they'll even get some votes in the southern states. This was just the first of many speeches that Chase makes for Lincoln during that 1860 presidential run, including speeches across the river in Kentucky, a slave state at the time, which was a very hostile audience. You know, we're so accustomed to thinking of President Lincoln that we forget how close the 1860 presidential race was, how easily Lincoln might not have gotten a majority in the Electoral College. That would have turned the election to the House of Representatives, which almost certainly would not have selected Lincoln as our president. It didn't happen thanks to Chase and the others who went out and gave speeches for Lincoln. And Lincoln knew that, and he was going to reward Chase. He asked Chase to come to Springfield, Illinois, the state capital, in early January of 1861. That's the first time the two men meet in person. Lincoln, they talk about the situation and they talk about the cabinet. Lincoln says that he probably is going to make Chase the Secretary of Treasury, but he can't quite give him a definite offer because he's already offered the position to Simon Cameron, a Pennsylvania politician with, how shall we say, a very dubious and shady reputation. As you can imagine, this notion, well, I'd like to offer it to you, but I can't quite offer it to you yet, that didn't go over real well with the proud Chase. Indeed, until the day of Lincoln's inauguration, Chase was telling his friends that he wasn't sure that he would serve in the cabinet. Indeed, Lincoln nominates Chase. Chase is confirmed by the Senate, and Chase is still sort of wavering as to whether he is going to serve. And we don't really have all the details, but it would seem that Lincoln summoned Chase to the White House, and they had a face-to-face, and Lincoln said, look, you've got to do this. We're in a crisis, a financial and secession crisis, and that Chase agreed. So what does he do as Secretary of Treasury for the next 4 years? Well, obviously, the most important immediate task is to raise the money to fight the Civil War. The federal government, at the time that Lincoln and Chase take over, the federal government is spending, let's say, $50 million a year, roughly. By the time Chase leaves, the federal government is spending $1 billion a year to fight the war. In other words, spending has increased by a factor of 20 in that 4-year period. How does he raise all this money? Well, to some extent, he doesn't raise the money. To some extent, he just runs the printing press, and there's some inflation, although nowhere near as much inflation as in the South. But to some extent, he raises it through a very clever, what we would call a war bond campaign, to sell government debt in small denominations to the public. And to some extent, he raises it through taxes. Yes, the first federal income tax comes in under Chase as Secretary of Treasury. Almost as important, Chase uses the crisis of the war to push through legislation to create a national banking system and a single national currency. You know, we didn't have that before the Civil War. What we had were hundreds of banks chartered by the states, almost unregulated by the states, and those banks in turn issued something like 10,000 different kinds of banknotes. It was the golden age of counterfeiters because with all of these different banknotes circulating, it was very easy to get a printing press and pretend to, create banknotes from the First Bank of Columbus and then take them to California and present them, and who would know that these were not the proper banknotes of the First Bank of Columbus. And Chase had been thinking about these issues and writing about them for a long time, and now he pushes through legislation over a lot of Republican objections to create the national banking system and to give us a single national currency. His third major role is as advisor to Lincoln and as a cabinet member. And this is not just on financial matters, where Lincoln more or less just lets him do what he wants. No, this is on military matters and political matters and foreign diplomatic, the whole range of issues, notably slavery and emancipation. The most famous meeting of the Lincoln cabinet is in July of 1862, when Lincoln presents for the first time to his cabinet a draft Emancipation Proclamation. And Chase's diary, which is an amazing resource, not just for the Civil War, but for his entire life. It's our best account of that meeting. Chase describes in his diary how Lincoln presents the proclamation, and he quotes himself as saying that he doesn't really favor the approach that Lincoln is suggesting, which is a nationwide proclamation. What he favors is sort of a district by district emancipation by the military commanders. But he says that Lincoln's draft is so much better than inaction on the subject that I should give it my entire support. But the cabinet as a whole does not support the proclamation at this point. Notably, my man Seward is opposed. In the weeks after this meeting, Chase continued to press Lincoln on emancipation. He writes in his diary after an August cabinet meeting, for example, that he expressed my conviction for the 10th or 20th time that the time for the suppression of the rebellion without interference with slavery had long passed. I love that phrase, the 10th or 20th time. You could see why, from time to time, Lincoln found Chase a little annoying. He argued at this cabinet meeting, again, according to his diary, that blacks were really the only loyal population worth counting in the South, and that in the Gulf states at least, their right to freedom ought to be at once recognized. And Chase indeed puts pen to paper a couple weeks later and drafts an Emancipation Proclamation along those lines. You can see it in his handwriting in the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress. A draft which, as best we can tell, Lincoln doesn't respond to. But on September 22nd, after the North had sort of pushed the South out of Maryland, Lincoln brings the issue up again at his cabinet. And again, Chase's diary is our best source. And he describes with wonderful phrases how Lincoln sort of hesitatingly refers to having made a promise to his maker that he was going to issue this proclamation if the Northern armies drove the Southern out of Maryland. And he reads them the draft. At this point, Lincoln says, I'm doing this. I'm not asking you whether I should do it. I'm doing this, and he just asks them for advice about the wording, which they provide. And the next evening, after it's published, a crowd comes to Chase's house for a speech. This is one of the wonderful 19th century traditions. If you wanted a politician to speak, you could just show up at his house and sort of be loud, and he would come out and give you a speech, or usually, not always. And he does give a speech, really one of his great wartime speeches, in which he says that nothing had ever given him more sincere pleasure than to say amen to this last great act of the Chief Magistrate. In my judgment, it is the dawn of a new era, and although the act is performed under an imperious sense of duty, created by military exigencies which give him the power to perform it, it is nevertheless an act of humanity and justice. Now, the standard view of Chase and Lincoln is that they were rivals, that Chase disliked and denigrated Lincoln, and then they did not work well together. I disagree with that somewhat. They were rivals, for sure. They were rivals for the 1860 and the 1864 nominations. But Chase did not dislike or denigrate Abraham Lincoln. An example, in August of 1862, the two men sit side by side, and closer than you all are sitting to one another, at a rally on the steps of the Capitol in Washington. And after the first speaker, Lincoln leans over and whispers in Chase's ear that he thinks he ought to say a few words and get rid of myself. And then he sort of stands up to his full height and goes up, no microphone obviously, goes up and says a few words. And Chase writes in his diary that Lincoln's frank, genial, generous face and direct simplicity of bearing took all hearts. His speech is in all the prints and evinces his usual originality and sagacity. Frank, genial, generous. These are not the words you use to describe someone you dislike. To be sure, there are moments of tension between Lincoln and Chase during the Civil War. One issue they disagreed about was black laws, laws specifically aimed at the black former slaves. Lincoln, in something we now refer to as the 10% plan, said that he would not disapprove of such laws. He shared a draft of that with Chase, and Chase wrote him to say that he disagreed strenuously with this idea that there could be one set of laws for the white residents of Louisiana and a different set of laws for the black residents of Louisiana. He wrote them, Chase to Lincoln, "My own strong impression is that special legislation for colored citizens will be as unnecessary as for white citizens. The demand for labor will secure them employment, and freedom will enable them to buy and build with the proceeds of their labor, while the voluntary charities, already so widely awakened, will, with proper support and countenance from the government, secure to them the benefits of education and religion." And I should mention, by the way, and there's a lot more about this in the book, that Chase, as Secretary of Treasury, was very actively and closely working with private charities who were trying to help the former slaves in places like the Sea Islands of Georgia. Because Chase was more concerned about black rights, because Chase was deemed by many a better administrator than Lincoln, there were a lot of Republicans who favored Chase rather than Lincoln for the 1864 presidential nomination. And Chase did not discourage these people. Indeed, if you read his letters, you could say that he encouraged these people, although he was very careful never to say that he was encouraging them. These efforts failed, however, in February of '64, when a pro-Chase letter known as the Pomeroy Circular was leaked and printed in the newspapers. Chase immediately wrote Lincoln to offer his resignation. After considering it for a few days, Lincoln wrote back to Chase and said, "No, I don't want your resignation. You're doing good work, and I don't see any reason for you to stop doing that good work." But here in Columbus, the Republicans in the Ohio legislature were not so forgiving as Abraham Lincoln. No, the Republicans gathered together and in what one newspaper described as a stormy caucus, debated the issue of Chase versus Lincoln for the Republican nomination. And probably with some of Chase's friends having left because the voting didn't occur till midnight, and maybe others of Chase's friends not voting, the Republican caucus voted in favor of a strongly worded pro-Lincoln resolution. When Chase read this resolution in the newspapers, he immediately wrote back to a friend in Columbus, a Republican state senator, saying, "Okay, if you don't want me as the nominee, I withdraw." And that letter was printed in the newspapers, and Chase was nominally out of the campaign. But not everyone was sure. "The salmon is a queer fish," said the New York Herald. "Often it appears to avoid the bait just before gulping it down. And even after it is hooked, it has to be allowed plenty of line and must be played carefully before it can be safely landed." In other words, the New York Herald was quite sure that Chase was still a candidate. He was just lurking in the waters, waiting for the right moment to jump out and secure the nomination. Chase remains at the Treasury Department for another 4 busy months. There's a ton of stuff happening. But then in June of '64, he and Lincoln get at cross purposes over the choice of one of Chase's key subordinates, the man in charge of the New York office of the Treasury. Chase submits his resignation, and this time Lincoln accepts it. And Chase was a little miffed, more than a little miffed. He takes a few weeks of vacation, which he needed. He had been working nonstop, and I mean nonstop from the day he started in early 1861. But by the fall of 1864, where is Chase? He's back on the campaign trail, giving speeches for Abraham Lincoln and other Republicans. Again, we forget how close that election was, how easily, if things had gone a little differently, we might be talking about President George McClellan. And midway through that contentious election campaign, the Chief Justice, the aged Roger Taney, dies. Some newspapers immediately start saying, it'll be Salmon Chase as the next Chief Justice. And other papers say, no, it's not possible. Chase and Lincoln hate one another. Chase disagreed with this view in a long letter to his friend, Senator Charles Sumner. Doubtless, there was a difference of temperament on some points of judgment. I may have been too earnest and eager, while I thought him not earnest enough and too slow. On some occasions, indeed, I found it was so, but I never desired anything else than his complete success and never indulged a personal wish incompatible with absolute fidelity to his administration. As Chase probably expected, Sumner shared this letter with Lincoln, and it may have influenced Lincoln's thinking about the choice. Lincoln didn't make the nomination immediately. He waited until Congress assembled in Washington in December, and he learned at that time that if he nominated anyone other than Chase, the nomination would probably fail. And so he does nominate Chase. Chase becomes our Chief Justice. And he also continues to involve himself in politics. By modern standards, he's way too involved in politics while Chief Justice. At one point, he's giving a speech to a black audience, and he writes to a friend saying that he doesn't propose to cease speaking to and remembering his black friends just because he's in judicial robes. In conclusion, although he never reached the presidency, to which he long aspired, Chase was one of the great Americans of his generation. He accomplished great things in his public roles as senator, as governor, as Treasury secretary, as Chief Justice. But, and this is why it's so great to have this center named for him, he accomplished great things as a private citizen in organizing the Lyceum, in representing blacks in the courts of Ohio, in organizing anti-slavery political parties. Indeed, it is impossible to imagine Abraham Lincoln being elected our president in 1860 without the foundational work that Salmon Chase had done in creating anti-slavery politics in the 1840s and 1850s. Chase long dreamed of seeing America without slavery, and in 1855 and 1860, that dream seemed impossible, quixotic, unachievable. But he lived to see that day. He lived not only to see black Americans free of slavery, he lived to see black members of Congress and black senators. And so perhaps Chase's message for our own day is that we too can live to see our dreams of a better America come to fruition. Thank you. All right. I see the first question there in the check marks.
Pete Monsoor from the Department of History. We don't know much about his tenure as Chief Justice, at least I don't, so are there some notable pieces, decisions that came down from his court?
Sure. A couple. The Texas decision, which dealt with the question of whether Texas had lawfully seceded from the Union, to which he gave the answer, a resounding answer, no. That the Union was an indestructible union formed of indestructible states. The slaughterhouse cases, in which he's in the minority, a 5-4 decision, at a time when 5-4 decisions are very uncommon, which essentially sort of just writes out of the 14th Amendment this language about privileges and immunities. And then a decision that I love, and I know Randy Barnett loves, which comes down the very next day, Bradwell versus Illinois, in which the court considered whether Illinois could deny a woman the right to practice law. She was otherwise completely qualified, simply because she was a woman. And this time Chase is again in dissent. He's the sole dissenter. He doesn't write an opinion, but it's not hard to kind of reconstruct his opinion from other things that he wrote and said. He believed that the right to pursue a profession was one of the privileges and immunities protected by the new 14th Amendment, and that Illinois had violated Bradwell's federal constitutional rights when it denied her the right to practice law. So there are some important decisions. I would say, though, that in some respects, his importance as Chief Justice is not limited to the casebooks, because he does continue to be an active sort of member of the community. So sticking with women's rights, he's in favor, by this point, of women's voting rights. 50 years before women get the right to vote in the federal constitutional amendment, he's in favor of it. He writes to a friend that he's in favor, but he is in favor of, quote, making haste slowly. It does well in Wyoming, where women already had the right to vote, and would probably work equally well in Ohio, I love that, or Massachusetts, and might be adopted in other states progressively. I am afraid that our friend Anthony, he means Susan B. Anthony, is a little too fast. And he didn't just express these views in private letters. No, he's quoted in the newspapers as favoring giving women the right to vote. A quote which I can find thanks to modern newspaper technology being sort of repeated in the newspapers all the way into the early 20th century. So there are some important opinions which you'll get to when you get to that part of the book. But I'd say that, again, coming back to civics, culture, and society, he's a Chief Justice very aware of sort of broader sort of social causes as well as case law. Yes?
You may talk about this in the book, but it's always been something that I found interesting about Chase, which is, as you nicely described it here, the argument in opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 is through a kind of what we might describe as a constitutional originalism,
Yes.
Especially with reference to Article 1. But later, when he, of course, becomes Treasury Secretary, he engages in the national bank and a national currency, and I think about the writings back in the 1790s from Jefferson especially as being the first example of a kind of real, or not maybe the first, but one of the major arguments that we might call constitutional originalism, which is that a national bank and a national currency is manifestly not
Yes.
constitutional. And so I wondered if you, as a biographer, have a sense of how he navigated that paradox.
Not especially well. Initially, when this notion of a legal tender clause is presented to him as Treasury Secretary, he is not enthused. But people come to him from Capitol Hill and say, look, the bill is going to fail without this. And this is not the National Banking Act. This is the bill to raise more money that is desperately needed to pay the bills. And he writes one letter to Congress saying, oh, well, after thinking about it for a while, I'm in favor. And he's told, no, that's not good enough. We need a stronger letter. So he writes another letter. Then, and this is the moment that all my lawyer friends love most, when it comes time as Chief Justice to consider the legal tender clauses, not only does he not recuse himself, but he reverses himself. And he agrees with you and Jefferson and others who think that the legal tender clause was not constitutional.
Not me. I'm very happy about the legal tender clause.
Anyway, so he in essence reverts to his original views that was a stretch of the Constitution and sort of sets aside his wartime, we need to do this in order to get the bill passed temporizing.
So you speak about how he was very ambitious, but he was also very outspoken. Is there any indication or evidence of how he might have pulled his punches to some extent when he was seeking the presidency?
Well, he certainly, he had said these things about, say, black voting rights in the 1840s. He didn't repeat those things in 1860 as he's seeking the Republican nomination. They're out there in the public record, but he's not giving speeches to black audiences in 1860 and thus reminding people of his views on black voting rights and other black rights. And similarly, in 1860, he's adopting a much sort of softer tone, trying to sort of, as it were, remake himself more in the lines of Abraham Lincoln. No, I'm merely opposed to the extension of slavery. He says over and over in 1860 that both before the convention, but then afterwards when he's campaigning for Lincoln, that the Republicans have no intention of interfering with slavery in the slave states. And in some of his earlier writings, he had kind of raised arguments that would have interfered with slavery in some of the slave states. For example, at one point in the 1840s, he argued that slavery was only legal in the original slave states, like South Carolina, that slavery was not legal in places like Louisiana that were part of the Louisiana Purchase, because when the moment that the federal government purchased the Louisiana Territory, slavery was extinguished because of this, in his view, anti-slavery element of the Constitution. He didn't repeat that in 1860. So yes, Governor Taft, there are some evidences that he, how should we say, downplays some of the more controversial elements of his record in his quest for the nomination in 1860. It doesn't do him any good. This is an era before the internet, but the editors are still pretty on the ball. The editors find these quotes from his prior speeches, and the Democratic editors or the Republicans in favor of someone like Lincoln, and they print them in huge letters and say, see, you can't possibly choose Chase.
Thank you. I would like to ask you a little bit about Chase's education, which in his day was heavily a classical education. But there was debate in this era, particularly in the Civil War. You get the Morrill Act, which sets up land-grant universities, and the idea of having a more practical education outside of the classics. And so I was wondering how frequently Chase made allusions or appeals to classical antiquity when he was making his speeches and writings, in his writings.
It is certainly true that Chase's own education was, from our perspective, deeply impractical. Greek and Latin and huge measures of both. Dartmouth was, how to put it, a somewhat more progressive place than, say, Yale was. And so he did get a little bit more mathematics and science than he might have gotten if he had gone to Yale instead of Dartmouth. There are a lot of references to the classics in his letters, but not that many in his speeches. He's aware enough of the audience, and you've got to remember, at the time he graduates from college, something like maybe 1 out of 100 men and, 1 out of 100,000 women graduate from college. It's, and so he's aware enough that in speeches he's not using Latin, but in his letters, there's Latin, and he reads and speaks French pretty well. Indeed, at the point when they move to Columbus and he hires a French tutor for his daughters, he takes French lessons with that person. And on the subject of practical education, if I come back to Ohio State, I have to go back and dig. I think that somewhere in one of his letters, he does say something to the effect of that he's in favor of the land-grant college legislation. But it's not really in his domain. It's not something that he has to go up on Capitol Hill and lobby for. But he certainly was in favor. I mean, even as governor, he was pushing for more practical educations, agricultural, societies. Indeed, if memory serves, way back as a young lawyer, he joins the Agricultural Improvement Society of Hamilton County, even though he's not a farmer.
In follow-up to your last statement, could you speak to his relationship with Wilberforce College?
Sure. So Wilberforce College, for those of you who don't know, black school, and he is very keen from, I think even before he's governor. He's involved in friends with, I think he briefly serves on the board of trustees of Wilberforce, and he, in his will, leaves $10,000 to Dartmouth, his own college, and $10,000 to Wilberforce, which at the time was perhaps the second largest donation that Wilberforce had ever received. In other words, from their perspective, this was a huge check and sort of out of the blue. But he, he is strongly committed not just to education generally, but to education specifically aimed at and for black Americans, including Wilberforce, but also institutions in the South, which he supports as Treasury Secretary.